Welcome to The Explainer. So, today we're tracing the absolutely incredible and honestly pretty unexpected rise of the United States. I mean, it's a wild story of how a nation went from being practically ignored to becoming the most powerful country in history.
So let's kick things off with a big question, right? The one that really frames this whole story. How did a continent, a landmass that for, over 100 years was seen as little more than a roadblock? I mean, for a long, long time after its so-called discovery, North America just wasn't the main event. You had early explorers like Columbus. They were really just looking for a shortcut, right? A quick way to get to the spices and riches of Asia. The Spanish, they hit the jackpot with gold and silver way further south, so they basically looked at the northern lands and dismissed them as, well, useless.
Somehow transform into the most powerful and wealthiest nation in history? I mean, seriously, how did we get from there to here? Okay, let's really get into it.
All right, so to understand this, we have to go back, and I mean way, way back, long before any European ships even showed up on the horizon. This land was already home to these diverse, complex native societies that had been shaping the continent for thousands of years.
Okay, so what's absolutely wild here is the sheer scale of this timeline. Just look at the dates. We are talking about millennia of human history. The first peoples, they arrived around 13,000 BCE. Now, to put that into perspective, that first permanent English colony in 1607, it's just a tiny little blip at the very, very end. It really hammers home just how recent the story of the United States actually is compared to the deep human history of the continent itself. And let's be super clear about this. This was not an empty land. Not even close. It was a continent of many, many nations. You had the amazing city builders of the Mississippian culture, the sophisticated democratic Iroquois Confederacy. I mean, the list goes on. The arrival of Europeans was, well, it was catastrophic, mostly because of diseases that the native populations just had no immunity to. And it wasn't long after that the European powers started fighting over the continent's resources. So that brings us to the next big question. How did this hodgepodge of competing colonies turn into a single country? Well, that story starts with a spark, a revolutionary fire. And you know what it all came down to? Money. It always does, right? So after Britain defeated France for control of North America in what they called the French and Indian War, they were left with a massive bill, a huge debt. And to pay it off, they looked right across the Atlantic to the American colonies. So, what was Britain's solution? Well, they started piling on a whole series of new taxes. First it was sugar, then a stamp tax on literally all paper. Then they started taxing essential stuff like tea. Now, for the colonists, who had 0 elected officials in the British Parliament, you can imagine this felt like a huge overreach. And this is where we get that powerful, iconic rallying cry. It just perfectly captured all that anger the colonists were feeling. It fueled protests everywhere, boycotts of British goods, and, well, eventually, a full-blown war for independence. So after winning the war, you'd think the hard part was over, right? Wrong. The new nation almost collapsed immediately. Its first attempt at a government was, frankly, a total mess. You basically had 13 states acting like 13 tiny independent countries. So the founders had to go back to the drawing board. And what they came up with was the Constitution. This pretty revolutionary framework for a federal government that, with a few tweaks here and there, is still running the show today. Okay, so this young country, it wasn't content to stay small for long. Not at all. This idea started to take hold, something called manifest destiny. It was this belief that the U.S. was basically destined to stretch all the way across the continent. And that idea, it fueled a century of just relentless, explosive westward growth. And this just perfectly shows the sheer speed of that expansion. We're talking just over 60 years. Through a mix of purchases, annexations, and war, the country's footprint went from the Atlantic coast all the way to the Pacific Ocean. It's just incredible. And that Louisiana Purchase, it literally doubled the size of the country overnight. It has to be one of the greatest real estate deals in all of history. See, Napoleon needed cash and fast to pay for his wars in Europe. So he sold the entire territory for just $15 million. I guess he decided he needed the money a lot more than he needed an American empire. But all this rapid growth, this expansion, it was hiding a deep, poisonous division inside the country. And that was the institution of slavery. It was this festering wound that would eventually,
and tragically tear the nation apart in the absolute bloodiest war in its history.
The country really split along these two starkly different lines. I mean, you basically had two different Americas. The North was industrializing, building factories. The South, on the other hand, had an agrarian economy that was completely, fundamentally built on the labor of enslaved people. So when Abraham Lincoln got elected, the Southern states, well, they feared he would abolish slavery, and they seceded from the Union.
Well, the North's victory did preserve the country as one single nation. And, most importantly, it finally brought an end to the institution of slavery. But that joy of victory, it was tragically short-lived. President Lincoln was assassinated just days after the war was over.
And that brings us to the final major chapter of this whole transformation. A country forged in the fires of civil war would now turn its gaze outward. It was about to shed its long-held policy of just staying out of things and finally step onto the world stage. See, for most of its first century, the U.S. basically practiced what's called isolationism. It kind of kept to itself. I mean, protected by two massive oceans, it just focused on its own growth and tried its best to avoid getting tangled up in all the European conflicts. But as you can guess, that was all about to change. And this right here, this was the turning point. A rapid-fire series of events just completely remade America's place in the world. A short war with Spain. Boom, the U.S. suddenly has an overseas empire. The Panama Canal opens. Boom, it can project its naval power across two oceans. And then finally, its decisive entry into two world wars, well, that cemented its status as a global superpower. No question.
So, after World War II, you'd hope for peace, right? Well, not exactly. Instead, a new, incredibly tense rivalry came to define the entire globe. You had the US on one side and the Soviet Union on the other, two superpowers with completely opposite ideologies, competing for dominance in a decades-long standoff that we now call the Cold War.
In this period, it just perfectly captures the era's dual challenges. Think about this for a second. On the world stage, the U.S. was locked in this high-stakes, nail-biting race to the moon against the Soviets. But at the exact same time, it was facing this monumental struggle for its own soul right here at home, as the civil rights movement fought to end segregation and finally secure equality for all of its citizens. So when you step back and look at the whole picture, from being called useless lands to becoming a global superpower that landed on the moon, it seems like the one constant in the American story has been reinvention. It's often been turbulent, for sure, but it's always been changing. And that leaves us with one final fascinating question to think about. What will define its next chapter?